Now we turn to the final speaker of the night, the fifth speaker for the opposition to conclude the opposition's argument in tonight's debate, Keir Crozier.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I feel extremely privileged to be able to close this, our second great debate of the term. This is an issue which is to us, as members of a debating society, perhaps more pertinent than any other we have debated, for it affects our very ability to function, to carry out the purpose which the Literific serves. For no platforming is an attempt to stifle debate by the crudest means, an attempt to win the argument without having it in the first place, an attempt to erase the Enlightenment values of challenging prevailing orthodoxies, speaking truth to power, instead replacing them with a dull, unquestioning submission. We have seen people attempt to use this tactic here recently. It's been mentioned already. We saw it in the first great debate when the online mob tried to argue that we simply shouldn't hold the debate, or that at least Anne Widdecombe shouldn't be invited. We saw it again last week when similarly there were those who expressed the opinion my colleague on the opposition tonight, Mr. Jamie Bryson, should be no platformed. My response to such suggestions is this. If you simply do not like Miss Widdecombe or Mr. Bryson, whilst you're perfectly entitled to hold that opinion, it is nevertheless nothing more than ad hominem, and it does not serve as sufficient justification to preclude said individuals from speaking to our society. If, on the other hand, your hostility is not based on any personal animosity, but rather fear of what an individual might say, then I will quote you Voltaire, who said, "I despise what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it."
On that point.
Yes, go ahead.
First of all, thank you for being the only member of the opposition brave enough to take a POI. Secondly, Voltaire never made that quote. And thirdly, on your point of these people deplatforming speakers of the Literific, those people do not have the power to deplatform anybody. We, as the Literific Council, had that power, and we did not deplatform them. We chose to use our resources to let them speak, and we had every right not to do that.
Right, well, I'll address all 3 points you've made there. Firstly, thank you. I perfectly happy to take a POI. I probably won't have time to take any more, but hey, you can always chance your arm. Second one, I think Voltaire did say it. If he didn't say it, it's still true. And finally, sorry, Matt, so what's your last point again? Okay, I'll come on to him, sure, some teaching the speech. But no, yes, as the Literific, not the platforming the people, yeah. Which is quite right, but if anything, that's more case for our side of the argument. You took the right decision. I admire you for taking that. The people who wanted you to deplatform them, the ones who had the wrong viewpoint. So I don't really see how the fact that these people weren't deplatformed somehow makes deplatforming more right. And I would say, why should we fear what any speaker at our university has to say? Mr. Sullivan, you yourself, you talked about how it's only fascists and extremists who get deplatformed under the National Union Student Guidelines. But this isn't strictly true. I mean, Jordan Peterson has been no platformed at Cambridge University simply because he was pictured with a person who happened to be wearing a t-shirt with an offensive slogan on it. Jacob Rees-Mogg was attacked at Oxford University. And again, this is a member of Parliament of the Conservative Party, but yet he was there was an attempt by students to deplatform him. So it's not only fascist, and all the attention has come on the far right, but why not communist when communism has killed over 100 million people? There's also the point that has been repeatedly made by the proposition about that these are private companies. But when you have monopolies like Facebook and Twitter...
On that point.
No, thank you. I've already taken one, maybe later. When you have these companies who have monopolies like Facebook, like Twitter, in effect, they're more like phone companies than they are publishers. And it would be more like in the days of a nationalised BT simply saying, well, you're, let's say, transphobic or racist, things which maybe they're not laudable characteristics, but say we're going to cut off your telephone connection as a result. So I think when these people have this market share, that they have a responsibility not to abuse it. Similarly, as to universities, the idea that universities are private corporations, well, every university gets £22,000 a year from the government and government funding. They're publicly funded bodies, and therefore they have a right to uphold academic standards rather than simply pandering to the lowest common denominator. I'll address some points made by the second speaker on the proposition as well, Ms. Zaidi. She talks about how Nigel Farage gets a platform and complains that nobody on the far left gets a platform. And yet we have people like Bonnie Greer, Nish Kumar. I'm talking about Nigel Farage, no being realistic. Nish Kumar is a comedian. Owen Jones, Ash Sarkar, who went on TV wearing a T-shirt with the word Marx emblazoned on it, who proudly says, "I am literally a communist." And so I don't see where she gets this idea that somehow the media does not provide a platform equal, or if not greater, on the left than it does on the right. She also talked about the likes of Steve Bannon normalizing Trumpist views. But Donald Trump won a US presidential election. His defeat in the second US election was the most votes ever won by a defeated candidate. The idea that somehow these views are being normalized, that is the grossest example of bolting the door or closing the door when the horse is bolted. These views were normalized long before Steve Bannon ever went on television. She also raised the issue about how freedom of speech somehow conflicts with people's feelings of safety or freedom of religion. But I simply don't. I think this is a straw man. I just don't see how this affects us at all.
On that point?
No, thank you. Central to the case against no platforming is John Stuart Mill's idea of the free market of ideas. Just like a free market of goods, differing ideas compete against each other, and the good ones thrive and prosper, whilst the bad ones are shown up for what they are and rejected in a kind of intellectual Darwinism. Without competition, we end up with stagnation, as orthodoxies are not challenged, be they right or wrong. When subjected to scrutiny, a bad idea will be shown up for what it is, but this cannot happen when these ideas and those who advance them are simply silenced. On the contrary, they gain a certain mystique. Humans are naturally curious. They will seek out these ideas which are forbidden, and they will find them in the dark corners of the internet or extremist groups and communities where, unlike somewhere like Literific, they will not be properly challenged. The best challenge to a bad speech, be it hate speech or simply misinformation, is not to excommunicate those who preach it, but to provide the counter evidence. If we are confident that we are on the side which is good, which is morally and factually correct, then we have nothing to fear from open debate because we will be vindicated. The fear, of course, is for those on the proposition that if those who would spread extremist or misleading ideas are given a platform, then people will fall victim to them.
On that point.
No, thank you. But this is much more likely to happen if they are driven underground, where they flourish in a feedback loop of groupthink, than they are when challenged in the open. Of course, the issue of no platforming is not merely limited to hate speech, or indeed even speech which may be considered offensive. We have also seen people no platform based on the accusation that they are peddling misinformation. This has come to the fore in particular in the last year, where people have come under fire, many of them distinguished scientists and even Nobel Prize winners for chemistry, for their criticism of the handling of the coronavirus pandemic. For example, YouTube temporarily suspended Talk Radio's channel because they provided a platform to lock down skeptics, whilst Google blocked research results for the Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated for a targeted protection approach as opposed to universal lockdown. The Guardian journalist Owen Jones even criticised the media for giving the eminent oncologist, Professor Clara Sikora, a platform. What was Sikora's crime? Supposedly he was guilty of being too optimistic. To call Professor Sikora a lockdown skeptic is to stretch the term to breaking point. He has continually encouraged people to abide by restrictions, whilst encouraging people to get their cancer symptoms checked and generally holding a glass half full approach. But for Owen Jones, even this is too much. He should be no platformed. But perhaps Mr. Jones ought to cast his mind back. Just over a year ago, the World Health Organization proclaimed that COVID-19 was not transmissible from human to human. If one had claimed that it was, one would have been guilty of misinformation. Later, during the peak of the first wave, both the World Health Organization and their own government scientists claimed that masks were ineffective and should not be worn. Had one disagreed and encouraged people to wear a mask, one would again have been guilty of misinformation. Yet when one looks at how quickly the science, to use that detestable but also popular trump card, changed, the idea that to disagree with the prevailing orthodoxy is somehow dangerous becomes frankly laughable. This is nothing new. In the 1960s, we used to give thalidomide to pregnant women to cure morning sickness, until we discovered it caused children to be born with missing limbs. As Umar mentioned, we used to think the sun revolved around the earth. The story of science is a story of thinking things that were true and then discovering they weren't. And the only way to make these discoveries is allowing people to ask questions. In 1633, Galileo was imprisoned for claiming the earth went around the sun. The Enlightenment was supposed to have put this kind of behavior firmly in the past. And yet tonight, we have a proposition who want to bring it back. And on this proposition, I do notice that all their arguments come from what could broadly be described as a left liberal basis. Indeed, the examples they have given are on the right, such as Donald Trump and right-wing ideas that ought to be deplatformed. But the liberal left does not have a monopoly on no platforming. We can look at Nazi Germany with its burning of books and banning of opposition. We can look at China's censorship of the internet. We can look at the blasphemy laws which remain in Islamic theocracies in the Middle East. The suppression of dissent has long been and will continue to be the favoured tool of tyrants of all stripes. The proposition, I would suggest, is guilty of wishful thinking, in that they assume it will be people like them who think the way they think, who will hold the power to decide who and who will not have a platform. The only way to ensure reasoned and fair debate is to hear all ideas, challenge them, and trust in the intelligence of the people to determine what is right. And trust is ultimately what tonight's debate boils down to. The proposition does not believe that you have the intelligence to be allowed to tell right from wrong, fact from fiction, to make up your own minds. We do. The motto of our venerable and veritable society is Sapere Aude, which translates into dare to know, words which Kant saw as the guiding principle of the Enlightenment. But to know, first we must dare to ask, and only one side on tonight's debate wants to silence the voice of those who would do so. And therefore it is clear that tonight you must vote for the opposition. Thank you.